So I'm very happy to welcome everyone on the occasion of this talk on settler memory and islanding and archipelagic perspective, which is being delivered by one of our junior fellows, Raka Banerjee. I welcome all members of the audience and I welcome Dr. Raka Banerjee also. She has been working on this subject for 1.5 years here as a junior fellow. And of course, she has also engaged with me personally on this subject on several occasions. It is an interesting and important story for a variety of reasons, some of which I will try to foreground. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which even now have a population, I believe, of less than 500,000, if I am correct, probably less than 4 lakh or something. They had a very small population when India got independence. And as we are aware, they were developed by the British partly as some sort of penal colony. Of course, there was a cellular jail there, which I think came up sometime in the early 20th century on that, what is it called, panopticon model of jail building, if I'm correct. Yes. So, in popular imagination, of course, Andaman and Nicobar Islands were described as Kalapani, and a lot of our revolutionaries, freedom fighters from the 1860s were forcibly sent there, and of course, the cellular jail came up much later. The point about it is that when India got independence, these islands, which are very numerous, if we put together big and small ones, probably the number would be something like 400, 500. But obviously, only some of them are large enough for human settlement. So, they had a very small population, and India was partitioned at the time of independence, and from what is now Bangladesh, a large number of people gradually came, unlike in the case of Punjab, where most of the migration from what is now Pakistan happened between 1947 and 48. In the case of eastern India, most of the migration from what is now Bangladesh happened over years and of course even decades. So she has tried to explore the subject of how the policy makers on the one hand sought to find physical space, especially land, agricultural land, for the refugees who came from Bangladesh, because we know that refugee rehabilitation was a very important task before the young nation state. We had refugee camps quite close to Delhi, and even Faridabad, Panipat, and so on. Now, in the case of Bengal, there was one more important reason that land settlement or land was required for settling the refugees in places other than West Bengal. And that was, from what I know, the migration, both in terms of the number of people and in terms of the land left behind by them, was asymmetric between West Bengal and East Bengal. So, which means that there was very little land which was vacated by people in what is West Bengal, on their leaving for East Bengal, because one, very few people left for East Bengal, and second, of course, even those who left probably did not leave much land behind. So this was an additional layer and nuance in the policy which was evolved by the leaders of the country in the 1950s, broadly speaking. So in that context, achieving two objectives simultaneously by settling, and I don't think they have used the word colonizing, probably they have used words like settling, integrating, making them a part of the nation, and so on. So on the one hand, the objective of the Indian state was to integrate them and to have, as they say, feet on the ground, have people actually live there, because it was regarded as a strategic requirement. And on the other hand, of course, land had to be found, people had to be settled there. I mean, had to be settled somewhere, and in that it was found convenient that some of these families which had come from Bangladesh should be settled in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. What has happened is that today the bulk of the population, and I have visited it recently, so maybe that is one reason these things are fresh in my memory. So the bulk of the population of these islands today has this provenance of Bengali speaking people, mostly from East Bengal, but there has been some later migration from what is West Bengal also. But probably 90% of the Bengali speaking people who are there, they have their origins in East Bengal. They came as refugees over the years, and with government help and support, they were settled there. They were assigned sometimes small plots of land of 3 to 5 acres, sometimes more. And this was important because there is a social dimension also there of the refugees who came from, who were settled in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Of course, refugees of various social classes came from Bangladesh, but it is an interesting fact related to this subject that the people who were settled in Andaman and Nicobar Islands belonged mainly to one community of Bengal, which was the Namashudras, which were disadvantaged, deprived, and which were unfortunately classed as an untouchable community. So Raka's work is a very interesting foray into how the social experience and the cultural world of these people changed after settling in Andaman Nicobar Islands, because one, they were far away from their place of origin, and naturally social position changes, or at least has the potential to change. When you are in your village or in your small town, your identity is a given thing and you are classed within the given hierarchy. But when you go to far off place, the possibilities for shift in your position and identity do sometimes open up. So this is one of the most interesting things she has done about how they sort of built up their identity over the decades, and what are their memories of settling the island. Almost you can say as the first peoples, though they are not technically speaking, but they have created that memory, and memory of settling down in these islands which she is calling islanding, and how, because there are so many islands, so it developed into an archipelagic perspective. So with this short background, let me once again welcome Raka and request her to start her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra. I also thank PMML for the generous fellowship which has allowed me to undertake this research. Just a quick recap. In my previous talk, I had introduced the rehabilitation scheme of 1965 to 1980 for the settlement of mainland populations, particularly the Bengali refugees and migrants of the partition. The rehabilitation scheme accounted for the settlement of 803 Bengali families, 45 Burmese, 72 Sri Lankan, and 330 ex-servicemen families across the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And like Sir pointed out, this scheme moved away from the imperial language of colonization to the statist conception of integration of territory within the body of the new nation state. So the focus of the previous talk was on a particular settlement of Middle Andaman, which is called Betapur. I used that as an illustration of state-settler negotiation and its impact on the implementation of the agenda of integration. The current talk focuses on first and second generation settlers' memory of the process of settling the islands, and I use a term that comes out of the island studies literature, which is islanding. And the talk demonstrates with 3 accounts the interconnected histories of settlement across the islands, which prioritizes an archipelagic understanding over an islanded one. I draw from both archival material as well as archival material that I have collected from the Andaman and Nicobar Secretariat Archive in Port Blair, as well as field-based interviews across the islands. And so, structure of the talk is I'll begin with a case of one educated Bengali couple arriving to the islands in 1961 due to the woman's employment as a stenographer with the Ministry of Rehabilitation and setting up of a photography studio by her husband at the same time. The second section takes us to the case of a settler woman who had organized a hunger strike in Diglipur, North Andaman, in 1968, inquiry into which opens up the possibility of studying archive field interface around this event. The third section takes up the settlement of Neil Island, which was recently in 2019 renamed as Shohid Deep, where similar unrest was happening in 1969, but the settlers resorted to more strategic ways of negotiating their demands. And this is followed by a history of establishing Neil as a model settlement and a successful example of the tourism economy in the islands. The final section turns to the remotest inhabited island in the Andamans, namely Little Andaman, where the same Bengali photographer that we introduced earlier in the talk, his lens has preserved the indigenous Ongi way of life in the face of expanding settlements in the 1970s. So, Shobita Shannal and Pramotho Kishore Shannal arrived in Port Blair in the year 1961. A graduate of Ashutosh College in Calcutta, Mrs. Shobita Shannal was working as a stenographer in the Ministry of Rehabilitation when she was offered a transfer to either Delhi or to Port Blair. Shobita Shannal had a relative in Andaman, an uncle who owned a coconut and areca nut plantation in North Bay, very close to Port Blair, and this became a deciding factor in her choosing Port Blair over Delhi for the transfer. She had to be given a substantial increment to entice her into this so-called remote posting. Her husband, Pramotho Kishore, was trained in photography and cinematography from the iconic Bone and Shepherd studio in Calcutta. Incidentally, established in 1863, this Bone and Shepherd studio is considered to be the world's oldest photography studio, which closed down as recently as 2016 after a devastating fire. He worked as an assistant cameraman with directors like Oshit Sen in Bengali film industry, as well as a licensed cameraman under the West Bengal government. After arriving to the islands, Shannal had to find work for himself. He decided to open a photography studio in Port Blair. But setting up a photography studio in an island cut off from the mainland by at least 1400 kilometers was a challenging task. He rented a shop space on the ground floor of Ratnam Nivas, owned by the family of K.R. Ganesh, who was the first nominated member of parliament from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in 1967. Studio equipment had to be shipped from the mainland, which took months to arrive. When he could not manage to find a photographic enlarger, he had to create a homemade device with whatever was at hand. According to his son Obhijit Shannal, he had the condenser and the lens, but he did not have a box. So he used a milk tin powder milk tin. He used a powder milk tin instead to create a makeshift enlarger in place of the actual enlarger. His ingenuity was not limited to photography alone. In fact, he even tried his hand at carpentry during the making of his studio. Finally, Memory Studio was established by Pramotho Kishore Sannal in 1962. At present, the studio occupies a small section of the ground floor of an obviously crumbling building. It was apparent from where I was standing across the street that the first floor had long been abandoned. The studio itself is a fairly well-maintained setup with a small reception desk and photography area in one room, another room for the computer printer photocopier system, and a small room at the back for miscellaneous storage purposes. Pramotho Kishore's younger son Abhijit Sannal is perhaps the current as well as the last proprietor of the studio, because the studio is poised to shut down in the near future. I had encountered the name Memory Studio through markings on small paper envelopes carrying passport-size photographs of island residents preserved in the official files of the Secretariat Archive in Port Blair. The studio also used to have a collection of photographs from the 1950s and 60s when large numbers of refugees of the partition were being resettled in the islands. Most of these images were taken for administrative documentation depicting a range of activities undertaken by the rehabilitation, forest, agriculture and public works departments in the newly established settlements. An island-based academic had shared soft copies of such images from Neil Island that showed refugee-turned-settler families deboarding the light cargo transport ships near a temporary wooden jetty. The series also contained a few images of freshly erected barrack-like structures to house these incoming families, as well as images of deforested plots of land where these families were to be eventually settled. I will show these photographs once I'm talking about Neil Island in detail. But for now, unlike Shobita Sannal, who arrived to the islands as a government employee with her husband as a dependent family member and came from a very different socioeconomic background, most mainland Bengali women arriving to the islands during the same timeline came as attached women, which is a bureaucratic terminology for women who were attached to the male head of the household seeking rehabilitation benefits from the state. Now, the dominant discourse has constructed settlement as a masculine prerogative and the man as the settler prototype. So, the archival evidence of one Srimati Sarojini Shamadar observing a hunger strike in Diglipur of North Andaman struck out to me even more starkly. This account is from 1968, wherein a female settler began a hunger strike protesting the collection of loan amounts given to these households to settle themselves under the colonization scheme. The protest began with the objective to pressurize the administration into writing off their colonization loans. Settlers had received a loan of rupees 1730 per family, which included a loan of rupees 800 for house building, rupees 700 for the purchase of plough animals, cost of utensils, seeds and manure adding up to another rupees 230 at the rate of 4.5% interest, recoverable in 10 annual installments. However, the administration found it difficult to recover these loans from the settlers. The task of settlement and agricultural expansion could not move at the pace anticipated by the administration. Settlers struggled to grow crops, sell them at profitable margins, and also happened to squirrel away some extra money to repay these loans. Further, the first few batches of settlers were given these amounts not as loans but as initial capital to set themselves up in the islands. These factors constrained the new settlers' ability to repay the colonization loans as expected by the administration. Under these circumstances, a settlers' agitation that was organized due to the pioneering role of a settler woman can easily be considered historic. So, correspondence between the Deputy Commissioner and the Chief Commissioner of Andaman and Nicobar Islands informs that one Sarojini Shamadar and a settler male by the name of Shoshidhar Mondol began a hunger strike on 25th of May 1968 after the Tehsildar of Mayabandar attached one settler's property in Kishorinagar village, and thereafter settler processions were being taken out daily to press for the release of this attached property. All revenue officers were issued instructions not to resort to coercive measures like attachment or sale of movable and immovable settler property for recovery of colonization loans. While the settlers' property was immediately released, a group of 42 settlers, including a former member of the Home Minister's Advisory Committee, observed a token hunger strike on 17th of May 1968. and began building the base for a prolonged agitation to write off these loans. MP K.R. Ganesh asked the leaders to call off the strike, and the local administration advised the agitators to go back and start cultivation. However, following a public meeting on June 8th, they resolved to picket at government offices if their demands were not met in the next few days. They even left their plows in front of the BDO's office as an indication of their resolve. From 25th May to 10th June, the peaceful protests carried on without the administration yielding to the settlers' demands. It was reported to the Chief Commissioner that Horlicks, barley, water, lemons and lime juice were noticed in the hunger strikers' pandal. They were also seen eating thin arrowroot biscuits and were taken to attend the call of nature. This further led the local administration to believe that they might have been taking milk undercover. Moreover, the letter begrudged the hunger strikers' satisfactorily healthy condition, indicating it was not a hunger strike at all. Another correspondence notes the agitation as a political stunt. The letter stresses on the hunger strikers' normal health condition and details of their alleged food consumption to anchor the image of the settlers as troublemakers and inauthentic conniving persons looking to con the administration of resources and facilities. The administration believed the settlers were reluctant to pay the loans, implying their financial capability to repay the loans but their assumed unwillingness to do so. The inability of the settlers were painted by the administration as premeditated reluctance, highlighting the innate mistrust between the two. Eventually, the agitation and the hunger strike were called off on 10th June 1968 after the island administration decided to write off the debts. Correspondence in the file further notes that while the ill-advised agitation was allegedly being conducted on no party lines, it was supported by the Secretary of the Revolutionary Communist Party of India, in addition to some congressmen in their individual capacity, according to the letter. Eager to quarantine the island settlements from the refugee militancy of Bengal, the administration took active steps to prevent the rise of self-appointed leaders. The recurring need to produce the island space as non-political in the vein of promoting anti-factionalism and strengthening its diversity as a resource feeds into the idea that politically oriented settlers are undesirable and troublemakers, as was the case in Bengal. In his book, the island-based academic Shopon Bishwas mentions how two ringleaders were sent back to the mainland, presumably for protesting upon arrival in the islands, reaffirming the need to produce the islands as a sanitized space that could be socially engineered to become a mini India. Instances of such overt resistance are rare. Therefore, in an attempt to trace Sarojini Samaddar's family in Diglipur, I contacted several second-generation settlers, including the late MP Manoranjan Bhakto's associate, Nogen Haldar. His name, I have used his real name, not a pseudonym, because he was very much a part of the active politics there and he was okay with me using his name. So, as a Congress party worker and later a member of the Home Minister's Advisory Committee, he played a key role in negotiating the pardon of the settlers' loans. Now in his 80s, he was at the forefront of these protests and strikes, but failed to recollect any Sarojini Samadar or Shoshidhar Mondal ever having participated in the protests, let alone conduct one in a leadership position. Nogen Haldar mentioned there were other sporadic and smaller protests across the villages of Diglipur and mused that these settlers could have been part of similar such sporadic protests. Others, like Dvijen Sarkar, who was a young boy at the time of the protest, recalled one Shoshidhar Mondal who passed away a few years back, but he too could not tell me who Sarojini Samadar was. However, he ventured an interesting guess that during the strikes, government officials must have spoken to only a few people at the gathering, and someone or the other might have supplied him a fictitious name. And since multiple gatherings were taking place, the name could have been given to divert attention or to protect the real male leaders. Other explanations bordering on conspiracy theories suggest that settlers were aware of the clause to repay the loan and they had in fact agreed to it in the beginning. Later, they were incited by leaders like Bhakto and others to refuse repayment. In fact, there were even provisions for later generations of settlers to receive an additional land of around 7 bighas from the administration as and when their families grew. When settlers began their hasty agitation to stop the repayment of loans, the administration too backtracked on their promise of allotting land to the future generations. The documents containing this clause in the island's Land Reforms Act, which were stored in the Deputy Commissioner's office, were burned down in a deadly fire, which also razed the building to the ground. In course of conducting field work in the district of Northern Middle Andaman, I have been repeatedly approached by several participants to search the archives for documents relating to the LRA. I too have not been able to trace any such clause in particular during my time in the archive. An island-based artist who grew up in Diglipur commented that settlers used their cunning to beat the government but ended up losing in the long run. RTIs by local NGOs too have not yielded any results so far. This episode highlights the slipperiness of public memory in the face of evidence provided by the state's archival memory. It is also significant on another more practical aspect, that is, the case of the Diglipur settlers provided all the other Bengali settlers across the settlements with a model of protest to get their loans revoked. During the same time frame, protests became a regular feature in the settlements, and the administration had to adapt their strategies in dealing with these settlers in order to effectively quell such events. The settlement of Neel Island, now Shohid Deep, is one such example. In the beginning of the rehabilitation scheme, Neel Island was supposed to provide transit accommodation to the refugee families before they could be dispatched to their respective settlements. The Bengali settlers who eventually settled down in Neel arrived in 2 batches in 1967 and a final batch in 1969. In a 1968 survey by the Ministry of Rehabilitation, the survey estimated the possibility of clearing 525 acres of flat land for paddy cultivation, which could sustain 175 cultivator families at the rate of 1.2 hectare of paddy land and 0.8 hectare of plantation land per family. However, this appeared to be an inflated estimate, and the number of settler families far outweighed the land available. Further, the land in Neel was rocky and flat land was limited. As a result, settlers arriving from riverine regions of Khulna, Faridpur, Borishal and Kumila in East Pakistan declared the land unsuitable for paddy cultivation. In a memorandum from October 1969, addressed to the members of parliament visiting the island, the settlers of Neel Island furnished the many ways in which they were faced with discriminatory policies of the rehabilitation scheme. Unlike the earlier settlers who received 5 acres of paddy land and 5 acres of hilly land, Neel settlers received not only significantly smaller land holdings but also faced arbitrary allotment of land and benefits to some settlers over others. In their 12-point memorandum, the settlers also stressed that they should not be used as PWD labor and forest labor, as they were brought to the islands to become cultivators. They even cited the case of Campbell Bay in Nicobar, where ex-servicemen were settled by the state, stressing on the differential treatment meted out to ordinary settlers of a refugee background. The use of Campbell Bay, a part of Nicobar district, as a point of reference indicates the settlers' awareness of rehabilitation benefits allotted to migrants elsewhere in the archipelago and challenges the notion that living on an outlying island meant complete isolation. Apart from illuminating the plight of Neel settlers, the joint appeal also indicates a more collectivized approach on the settlers' part, addressing their grievances directly to the visiting MPs instead of appealing to the island administration. And finally, resorting to more constitutional forms of protest. As a result of the settlers' continued appeals to the administration, it was decided in 1972 that 48 settler families from Neel would be allowed to shift to Little Andaman for settlement. The remaining 98 settler families were allotted 5 acres of flat land and 5 acres of hilly land in Neel. The settlers' early years were marked by acute scarcity of all manner of resources. The ship took 7 days to reach Neel from the mainland port in Calcutta. As there was no jetty, the transportees disembarked onto smaller boats to reach the island's shore. And the island had a thick forest cover with only a handful of temporary shelters for incoming settlers and officers for departments concerned with settling the island. Shukhin Haldar recalls, since Rothin Nag was a senior and sort of a leader, settlers would form a group and walk with him some 2 kilometers from their camp in what was then called Number 1 but is now known as Lakshmanpur, to the place where the jetty stands today, to collect their weekly ration from the supply godown. Rothin Nag would lead with a stick in one hand and a torch in another, instructing them to hide behind tree trunks, and the tree trunks of Neel Island are huge, they're massive.
Yeah.
So They would instruct them to, he would instruct them to hide behind the tree trunks if any elephants were spotted. Now, interestingly, these elephants were also shipped from the mainland to the island in order to drag the felled tree trunks and timber. The island received heavy rainfall for a better part of the year. Sun would not come out for months on end. Shopna Boral remembers these early days of the settlement. The lands were densely forested and mosquitoes, snakes, and centipedes lurked in large numbers. Chitra Das's husband used to work as labor, that is, a menial worker under the forest department. She recalled, one of the forest department staff died after a tree trunk fell on him. His bones were crushed so badly, he had to be bundled up with leaves and taken away. The sturdy trunks couldn't be struck down with axes. Besides, we wouldn't know which way it would fall. People have even died due to such incidents, recalled Rothin Nag, who worked as a labor himself. Settlers often got lost in the forest and had to be rescued by forest department officials. The settler children would help their cultivator parents carry headloads of vegetables and paddy to and from the market near the jetty, while also attending school as first-generation learners. The boat service from Port Blair would bring provisions once a month and later every 15 days. In the meantime, the settler women boiled seawater to make salt, prepared meals out of boiled papayas, and foraged the jungle to make ends meet. Even the clothes on the settlers' backs were provided by the government, reminds Anita Pal. She says, the government gave us 2 pairs of blouses, petticoats and saris upon arrival. But how long can it last? Sometimes we would only drape the sari around us without any blouses or petticoats. We cleared the forests, built our own house, and now we are firmly placed here, she asserted, echoing most first-generation settlers' sentiments. The settlers' interaction with the island's unfamiliar ecology went hand in hand with their constant negotiation with scarcity. Their stories of these early years highlight the community's hardships in creating a familiar landscape, particularly through cultivation work, and their narratives of struggle are both narratives of adaptation as well as islanding. Eventually, Neel came to be locally known as the vegetable bowl of Andaman, catering to over 75% of the island's food supply. Tomatoes, drumsticks, papayas grew particularly well. However, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami gravely impacted the archipelago and led to an increase in groundwater salinity, which adversely affected Neel's soil productivity. This altered nature of the island's once fertile soil is a recurring theme in interactions with the settlers. In her research, Ruhi Deol notes, farmers noticed a decrease in yield due to changes in wind patterns and the presence of salty air in the fields. In addition to untimely rain, overuse of pesticides to counter pest infestations and a shift to organic cultivation without adequate support mechanisms have significantly decreased Neel's agricultural output. This has resulted in increased reliance on livestock rearing and poultry farming. While the first-generation settlers note this loss of the soil's power, many agree that it's not just the soil that has lost its previous robustness, but it's also the people of the island. Tourism is held responsible for altering the hard-working nature of settlers and making the younger generations lazier and more reliant on easy income. In a perverse turn of events, both domestic and international tourism started to flourish in the islands, particularly in Neel and nearby Havelock, after the archipelago gained global attention following the devastating tsunami. Contrasting Neel's contemporary prosperity and connectedness via airways and waterways with the initial days of struggle, Anita Pal commented, there wasn't even one bicycle on Neel back then. The expansion of the tourism industry has resulted in a shift of the islanders' occupational pattern from traditional agricultural economy and cultivation work to the tourism sector. There is an acute shortage of wage laborers, as most locals choose to find employment in tourism and related industries. Higher daily wages in comparison to the mainland attract a lot of migrants, especially from the Sundarban region of Deltaic Bengal to the island. And Deltaic Bengal, both in the sense of West Bengal and Sundarbans in the Bangladesh bit of it. Shukhen Haldar, who was about 10 years old when he came to the island with his family, narrates the process of settling with respect to the current spatial organization of the island streets and landmarks. Neel wasn't quite a village, like you must have noticed while coming from the jetty to the market. The streets are lined with vehicles, tourists, and a constant flow of population. Our camp in number 1, where the Tango Resort stands today, our allotment initially was elsewhere, but the land was sandy and rocky, not suitable for cultivation. So we left those lands and came to where our settlement was finally given. But those lands which were earlier considered useless are now selling for crores, all because of tourism. The withouts, that is people who came without benefits and not as settlers by the administration, came at least 15 years after we did and encroached on these lands. They are much richer than us now. They have huge hotels and businesses like Tango Hotel and Neha Palace and so on. In narrating their pasts, first and second generation settlers choose to privilege one spatial map of the islands, that is the original settler geography, drawing from their memory, over another. Settler memory reveals layered geographies, one that settlers built in order to settle on the island, another that is being produced as a result of contemporary changes, and the transitional space between these, that make the island a palimpsest which the early settlers navigate in narrating their histories of islanding. Looking back at the time of their arrival to the island in 1967, Rothin Nag shared, "To this day you will find a dead tree stump on my land from that time," reminding us of this palimpsest nature of the island's geography. Like I mentioned, there were families which shifted from Neel to Little Andaman. So Little Andaman is situated roughly 70 kilometers southwards of Port Blair, and it is a tehsil in the southernmost outlying part of the South Andaman district and the remotest inhabited island. The island is mostly flat with a small hilly section in the north and a few perennial streams, which makes it particularly well suited to paddy cultivation. Now, the interdepartmental team recommended the clearance of a net area of 60,000 acres for agriculture and plantation work, as well as the expansion of forest operations like it was happening in other parts of Andamans. Settlement under the rehabilitation scheme took place in Little Andaman between 1968 and 74. And the Neel Islanders, who were earlier in Neel and came to Little, came in 1972. During this time, a total of 366 Bengali families were settled in primarily 4 villages: Netaji Nagar, Ramkrishnapuram, Rabindranagar, Vivekanandapuram, and Vivekanandapuram. The other village of Hudbe is the island's largest settlement and harbour. In addition to the Bengali settlers, the scheme also settled 8 Burmese families and 25 Sri Lankan families in Little Andaman. The entire settlement area comprised of 2,677 acres, so much smaller than what was earlier expected. Later, 165 tribal Nicobarese families from Car Nicobar were settled in Hermandra Bay for plantation work, and 95 Mopla families were also shifted from South Andaman to Little Andaman later on. In addition to agriculture, incoming settlers were trained in forest operations in order to fully exploit the abundant natural resources of the islands. Moreover, a rubber research and development station covering 500 acres was opened to promote the cultivation of rubber, wherein 37 families of repatriates from Burma were employed. In Little Andaman, the settlers received 5 acres of cultivable land, 1/3 acre of homestead plot, house building loans amounting to anywhere between between 2,000 and 3,000, a loan of 800 for buying plough animals, a loan of 1,500 for purchase of seeds, fertilizers and pesticides, another 1,200 for paddy bunting and soil conservation, and finally a 200 rupees loan for installing homestead wells. Now, unlike Neel, Little Andaman was already inhabited by the indigenous Ongi people, who were one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer populations of the islands. Now, the Indian state's desire to gain knowledge of the Ongis began with the establishment of a sub-regional office of the Anthropological Survey of India in Port Blair in 1952, which would regularly send research teams to Little Andaman. According to Venkateshwar, this was the inception of plans for colonizing Little Andaman and confining the Ongis to circumscribed areas within the island. So earlier, whole of Little Andaman was considered a tribal land and it was reserved, and eventually settlements started and their areas were allocated within the islands. The coast-dwelling Ongi people were able to continue their hunting, gathering, fishing way of life till the mid-60s, when programs for developing the island were announced and mainland population started being transported to the island. Venkateshwar notes much of these developmental activities from the mid-60s to the late 70s, namely clearing 30,000 hectares of forest for settler villages, commercial exploitation of forests under the ANFPDC, which is the Andaman and Nicobar Forests and Plantation Development Corporation, extraction of timber by private traders and illegal logging took place at the expense of the Ongi people's way of life. In addition to deforestation, for the construction of roads, public offices, private industries, a harbour, a sub-naval base, an agricultural farm and a helipad, as well as the introduction of red oil palm plantations, further pushed the Ongis to the fringes of the island. This brings us back to Promotho Kishore Sannal, the photographer whom we encountered at the beginning of this talk. The then Chief Commissioner, who according to Abhijit Sannal had an interest in anthropology, approached Promotho Kishore with a proposition to photograph the indigenous Ongi, Shompen and Great Andamanese people in their habitats. Before leaving on this several months-long tour, which Abhijit Sannal recalled was probably 2 or 3 months long, he doesn't remember it very well, Sannal had to provide a written declaration to the island administration stating his initial interest and taking individual responsibility in undertaking this task, because it would relieve the administration of any obligation in case of risk to life or anything sidewise. During this tour, which Abhijit Sannal recalls to have lasted for 2 months, his father spent several weeks in at least 3 locations. Ongi settlements in South Bay, Little Andaman, Shompen settlements in Great Nicobar, and Great Andamanese settlements in Strait Islands. He spent weeks living with each indigenous community, eating the food they ate and accompanying them in the work that they did. From the photographs shown to me by Abhijit Sannal, his father spent a considerable time with the Ongis of Little Andaman. The collection shows several photographs of wild pigs being roasted on an open fire, along with bountiful catches of sea fish and pandanus fruit, which is a staple of the islands. Of all the presents Sannal carried with him in order to befriend the indigenous people, tobacco seemed to be the most favored, making appearances in multiple photographs being consumed in a variety of ways, including being smoked in a homemade pipe which is fashioned out of a crab leg. So this pipe that you see in the photograph, it's made out of a leg of a crab. It's a shell. In addition to showcasing the unfamiliar practices of the archipelago's indigenous people, these images also invite us to contemplate the ethical implications of photographing and projecting them as civilization's others. The community originally lived in the Hut Bay area where there was an abundance of fresh water. The developmental activities and resettlement plans were implemented right in the middle of the Ongi inhabited area. Over the years, however, their habitational zone had become confined to 2 permanent settlements. One is in Dugong Creek in the north, which was settled between 1976 and 77, and the other is South Bay, where the photographs were taken at the southern tip in 1980. In order to make way for developmental activities as well as to ensure the survival of the declining Ongi population. The first recorded census of the Ongis in 1931 accounted for 250 people, which had seen gradual decline till the 1980s when it settled at 97 people. It remained stagnant for close to 30 years from 1981 to 2001 census, and then in 2011 the number rose to 101. A study published in 2020 indicates the number rose to 118 at the time of their particular fieldwork in 2017. After the tsunami, which had a devastating impact particularly on Little Andaman, accounting for 85% of all lives lost in the Andaman Islands, although no Ongi people died, the population of both these settlements were merged and only the Dugong Creek settlement exists now. So essentially the photographs were taken in a settlement, Ongi settlement, which does not exist anymore post-tsunami. In the settlement, this Dugong Creek settlement, non-Ongi personnel are temporarily posted by the Andaman and Nicobar administration, which includes 2 members of the Andaman Adim Janjati Vikas Samiti, AAJVS, 4 teachers, 2 health department staff, 2 Andaman Public Works Department staff, 2 wireless operators from the police department, 1 staff from the electricity department who operates the diesel generator set. Rest are police personnel posted for surveillance of the settlement. The settlement also has a primary healthcare sub-center, a community hall and a school up to the 8th standard. 2 Ongi women look after the operations of the Anganwadi, which takes care of the pre-primary education of Ongi children. There is also a helipad to airlift Ongi patients to Port Blair in case of emergencies. According to anthropologists, these development activities led to a sedentarization of the Ongi population, who became sequestered much like the Jarwa people. After resettlement, the community underwent several structural and cultural changes due to the introduction of policies like supply of free ration. This led to a gradual change in diet with less reliance on hunting gathering. Rice, roti, edible oil beverages like tea became part of this new diet, which, coupled with decreased physical activity, led to reduced stamina. These changes also impacted the Ongi life world as they moved away from traditional skills like basket weaving and crafting boats, which were closely associated with their hunting gathering lifestyle, and became increasingly reliant on a cash economy, which the settler population exploits in order to gain favors. According to a recent study, 34% of Ongis in the age group of 21 to 40 years are employed in electricity, education, and forest department of the Andaman and Nicobar administration. At the same time, the community is an introverted one. The previous Ongi settlement at South Bay was in close proximity to the Nicobarese settlement, but none of the Ongis had any social or marital alliances with the Nicobarese. While the creation of a tribal reserve has ensured the survival of the Ongis, the state's social engineering policies on the island have gravely impacted the community's way of life. I missed showing one photograph. This is of a Ongi couple with a variety of foreign items that photographers as well as earlier teams who went on expeditions had carried with them to sort of befriend the people. So, given all this, Pramotho Kishore Sharnal's photographs remain as a melancholic remnant of the now non-existent Ongi settlement of South Bay and the rickety memory studio as its last custodian. In weaving together these events, the talk highlights two key concepts. The first is of settler memory. The second is the process of islanding or making of the island settlements, to reflect on the role of the state's policies in producing Andaman Islands' post-colonial islandscape that underwent massive changes from the 60s to the early 1980s. During this period, the state took active measures to alter the notion of remoteness which was attached to the islands and consciously promoted the integration of the islands with the mainland through socio-cultural as well as infrastructural mediation. Transportation of mainland communities to the islands played a key role in implementing this agenda. Settlements were established at the expense of tribal dispossession and marginalization, and overall disruption of indigenous lives and habitats. On the other hand, refugee labor gave shape to the state's agenda, at the same time contributing to the process of placemaking, which inscribed settlers' histories onto the island geography. This history of settlement and transportation is alive in the memory of the first and second generation settlers, but due to the lack of intergenerational transmission, there has been a gradual erasure of this history of islanding. Sanyals, on the other hand, were not settlers, but they have become islanders and they have settled in the island. And their family history demonstrates the multiple forms of migration and settlement that took place in the islands. Further, the fact that it is a Bengali family is also relevant to the story, as Bengali staff were recruited with the explicit understanding that they would aid the task of settlement by drawing upon their cultural familiarity with that of the refugee populations. The talk argues that these changes altered the geography of the island alongside the identity of the actors administering these changes on the ground. In other words, for the latter generations, integration is successfully achieved by virtue of forgetting their mainland past. By putting into conversation the state's archive with field-based interactions, the talk brings out the complex network of settler-state interactions across the settlement locations, the slipperiness of memory encountered in piecing together a history of settlement, and rapidly altering settler geographies in the face of developmental changes from terra nullius to agricultural settlement to a coveted tourism destination. The transitions, however, do not imply an absolute overhaul of the islandscape. Rather, it is in the nature of change to retain residual elements of the past geographies, like dead stumps of felled trees, that continually remind their witnesses of the multiple spatial and temporal histories of the space. Finally, an archipelagic understanding uncovers these layered geographies that make the island a palimpsest, which only the first and the second generation settlers are able to navigate in narrating their histories of islanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and comprehensive talk, which all of us have enjoyed so much, especially because our knowledge of both of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and of the people who settled there after independence is mostly quite limited. So you have thrown very valuable light on this subject, and thank you very much. I hope you can benefit from the questions which have been asked by everybody, and maybe whatever you think is useful and possible, you can incorporate in your study going forward. So thank you very much, and I take this opportunity to thank all members of the audience for their presence, and let's join for tea now. Thank you.